We had any other questions that are out there. Just take one from you, please.
My name is Catherine Roger. I'm the head of the International Dialogue Secretariat based in UNCD in Paris. And I had a couple of comments, really, and I think, Natalie, I didn't come in, my train was late, so I apologise for being late. But I was very heartened to hear Natalie's comment and response to some of the questions, because I think what's really important in moving towards Addis is to put to bed this notion that in fragile or conflict-affected contexts, certain kinds of engagement are not possible. And I think some of the questions were kind of alluding to that. And I think the New Deal, since its very endorsement in 2011, has been trying incessantly to make this point that first priorities in fragile or conflict-affected contexts are about building institutions and focusing on peace building. And I think Addis provides an opportunity to restate that point. I think the fact that the SDGs Goal 16 has explicitly, given space to peaceful societies and effective institutions is reflective of that kind of normative consensus now. We're not imagining that in fragile contexts that we only can envisage a humanitarian solution. And that would bring me to my second comment, which was that on the yes, it is clear that we are seeing increasingly the number of conflict-affected or fragile situations increasing. And I think the argument that led to the New Deal in the first place needs to be restated, that even in context of extreme service delivery need, weak state capacity, we can still do things to ensure that state institutions are rebuilt. So the IHP Plus initiative, the post-Busan health sector-specific partnership, has made this point consistently, that in those Ebola-affected countries where, I'm talking about particularly the aid-orphaned ones, Guinea and Sierra Leone, it was clear that the health sector, all the things that donors signed up to in terms of using country systems, building capacity and so on, were really not happening. And so it was hardly a surprise that when, the crisis came, that those institutions are completely overrun, incapable of really responding. Admittedly, this is the point that the international dialogue has been trying to make. Admittedly, no one could have imagined or envisaged the scale of the crisis. However, or the crisis having happened, but the scale perhaps could have been tempered by a different approach those years prior to the outbreak. So those were really the points that I kind of wanted to emphasize. And I should probably know this, and we'll have discussions about this later, Helder, but I really wanted to get a sense, I wanted to see those slides again, those 8 asks. And I want to come back to Gideon's point about the language. I think, there's been a lot of discussion about whether we can get away with talking about conflict-affected as opposed to fragile environments or states in order to address the sensitivities that come with the G77 group around fragility as a group, a concept, and so on. So I'd like to hear perhaps how, in going to Addis, we're going to deal with that, or if we're going to deal with it, or if we're just going to be up front and centre with the fragility language, or whether we're going to I noticed in some of the slides we're referring to conflict affected. So I just wanted you to perhaps share with us where we are on that. Thanks.
There's a question here at the front.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Anna Muller and I work for Safe World. And I've been working very closely on Goal 16 in particular and been following the Finance for Development discussions as well. And I just have some general comments and then a question. And first of all, I think it's really important with building institutions and state ownership. But it's equally important to ensure that civil society and local stakeholders are involved in building those institutions, because it's also about building state-society relations. Secondly, I think conflict sensitivity when delivering development finance is key. Not only when it comes to ODA, but also the private sector. Yes, involving private sector, but also holding them accountable for their actions and ensure that they actually contribute positively to peace is also a key thing. And thirdly, I was just thinking of what you said about G77 pushing against not highlighting conflict issues in finance for development. Interestingly enough, in the latest working document of the Zero Draft, G77 actually proposed a whole new paragraph looking at conflict-affected states in particular, and it was actually pretty good. And I have our comment piece here with me so you can look at. And I was just wanting to mention the thing about fragility as well, which I also would like to hear your comments on, because there has been a lot of push against language on fragility from certain states. And Safe World has focused on language on conflict-affected states and countries emerging from conflict, because it is very controversial, and we suggest removal of the word fragility, and it would be interesting to hear your views on that. Thank you.
And Hamish, you?
Thanks. I'm Hamish Nixon. I'm a research fellow here in the Politics and Governance program at ODI. I have a question, I think, which arises from an observation over kind of 10 or 12 years of looking at the evolution of the search for fragile state ownership over assistance, and the kind of culmination of that in the New Deal and the challenges facing New Deal implementation, which is, it is a deal. There are two sides to it. The requirements on the donor side are meant to produce lower transaction costs for the recipient countries, possibly more resources, although maybe the G7 Plus would like to focus on the use of the resources first, and I think that's a great position. And the ability to kind of engage in ways that you wouldn't otherwise, and it is really interesting to hear about the really different risk profile of the EC funds, particularly as the kind of New Deal approach is that by jointly doing risk assessment, you're supposed to be able to take more risk, but it seems like the EC funds have been successful alongside on their own terms. And then on the kind of recipient side, there's the idea that there's a prioritization which allows those resources to be allocated to the most immediate priorities, and there's an ownership which makes sort of somehow the resources to be put to better use. Part of that ownership is about the plan, but part of it's about revenue mobilization, et cetera. And I've always felt that the prioritization upon which the international kind of alignment and harmonization is supposed to rest, and the local priorities is the difficult part, right? And now you have 5 peace and state building goals, which cover everything you would want to see, not only in a fragile state, pretty much in any society, but maybe in a higher priority in a fragile situation. But not all fragile situations are the same. And I think asking countries to come up with one vision, one plan, or a credible reform agenda, which is not too ambitious, as Natalie put it, in a way is not only a big ask for fragile states, it's actually a big ask for any state, because in our own countries, we don't achieve consensus about the prioritization around institution building. The point is that there are a set of institutions already in place for managing those discussions and conflicts. So the kind of institution building which is missing in fragile and conflict-affected situations is not a kind of cookie-cutter set of institutions which fulfill core functions. But I think those are the kinds of institutions we tend to focus on. The PFM, we can take a more creative or less creative approach to PFM, as Simon has outlined. But in the end, that is not an institution that necessarily processes conflict. And I think the real weakness underlying all this architecture, and I wonder, my question is, how can we address this, is that the institutions that are needed are actually the institutions of conflict management, and that when we talk about fragile and conflict-affected states, too often implicitly we're talking about a post-conflict situation, and that doesn't exist. If the institutions aren't built, then every single institution will be contested and fought over and political. And so I agree with John in the sense that it's not rocket science, but because compared to that, rocket science is comparatively easy. You just need a couple of pages of equations. In the case of building institutions in fragile states, how do we, my question, how do we encourage the process of creating the conflict management institutions that are going to be so different from country to country, which are going to process competing claims over how to prioritize the peace and state building goals across them and within them, etc.
Okay, and I'm just going to flag up to Natalie one question that's come into one of our online attendees of this event, and that is Catherine Dom over in Brussels. Catherine works with Makoro and has collaborated with ODI on a lot of things. She wants to know, has there been any thinking yet and ideas that have emerged about how you might deal with this tension in the design of state building contracts between short-term crisis management and longer-term state building? Have any ideas emerged about how to address those tensions yet? So, Simon, you can go first. Literally 2 minutes from each of our speakers, and then we'll try and wrap up.
I mean, just 2 quick points. I mean, just in terms of, yeah, there's always things you can do. I mean, I've just, one of my most memorable things was working the forestry program in Laos, where we, the people who were nominated to be the finance officer were the people who were the worst forestry officers. They were nominated to do finance, and we managed to build that group of people, that cadre, up into a group of people who could keep all their accounts district by district to an international accounting standard, which was audited by an Australian auditor. So I think if you can do it with the worst forestry you can get, you can do it with anyone. So that's one point I think you can do. I think in terms of, I think the priorities are different, just in terms of prioritisation, Hamish, your point. I mean, I've spent the last couple of days with Helder. He's got a fantastic story to tell about the way the G7 Plus brokered the election campaign in Guinea-Bissau, and I think the conventional donor response is to pour in huge amounts of money in terms of managing an election program. I think the G7 Plus did it in a different way, which had the result of it was cheaper, but that isn't really the point. It was done in a different way of consensus building at a different level, and I think there are things that different people can do, different actors, different partners can do that other partners can do, and again, it's this point of working collaboratively and using people for what they're really good at and other people for what they're good at, and not making the people who are good at something do something that they're not very good at. That's my 2 minutes worth, sorry.
Helder, do you want to?
Okay, thank you. I don't intend to answer it, but just wanted to see what we understood from the current negotiation on the draft outcome. Of course, as Anna and Catherine mentioned, there is a degree of sensitivity among, especially coming from G77 and China in particular, and also Brazil. But I can assure you that behind the corridor of the United Nations negotiation, there are a lot of intense negotiations between bigger power. We call big brothers and small brothers. So they sometimes the negotiation took place in the corridor. I said, look, you support us and I'll support you back in certain areas. That's how negotiation came. I think we all are looking forward for, hopefully next week, there is some kind of language and a compromise language proposed by our negotiating team in New York. From what I read, the penultimate version that was available up to a couple of weeks ago, there seems to be the intention of the G7 Plus plight is already captured there. For example, there is a new deal for engagement in fragile states. The new deal, we take note of the new deal that is developed by development partners and fragile states. And also regarding the language of fragile conflict-affected states, they didn't say this very clearly there, but somehow mention about countries in conflict and countries in fragile situations. So in order to kind of tone down the sensitivity. So this is the art of negotiation in New York. But from us, the G7 Plus point of view, I must say this, that from what we gathered from last week, when our colleagues from New York went to Delhi, when we had this big meeting in Delhi, they briefed us. They said that whatever happens, let's not be too obsessed by the wordings of the Addis Ababa outcome document. Look at the bigger MDG. It's a non-binding. But even so, there is no sanctions, no penalties, no anything for those who are even not achieved, especially coming from the developed Western world. So for us, the main thing is that at least a recognition, right? A recognition by the international partners that there is an element of fragile states being included so that we don't leave them behind again. That for us is a big win in our point of view. And then the rest, of course, we would like to see this universality of this goal in order to be applicable, and which has the implication on financing for development. And that's why if many countries can also propose in terms of the financing gap that the ODI has come up with a report of $73 billion, somehow in the next few years, 15 years, whatever, if you can also contribute to that. And then from our side, we will do a lot of homework from the government side, so that later on we can come back and don't point fingers at people, but we also point fingers at ourselves, that we are the one who push for it, and therefore we also need to be helped to have self-assessment on ourselves in order to be able to say to the world that we did our bits, and then you also did your bits. That's basically what we are aiming for the Addis Ababa conference. Thank you.
Okay. And just to finish, Natalie, some closing remarks.
Yes. On your question, how we think about to solve this question of tension between the short term and long term. So yes, we are thinking about how to extend possibly the duration of the state building contract, especially for the structural fragility. We could go towards a 3 years duration, renewable several times as much as necessary. We think also about the possibility to combine a state building contract with eventually a sector reform contract. So it means that as soon as a country will be ready to get a sector policy in a prioritized sector like health or education validated, we could go ahead with a sector reform contract on this policy, but continue at the same time with the state building contract. So this is a possibility, something on which we are thinking for the time being. But what we do not want, this is to create two types of state building contracts, because as I said, the fragility, structural and transitional, sometimes this is not so obvious. So what we want to keep, this is the flexibility of the tools. This is really the key element of the success of a state building contract. And this is also a learning by doing process. So this is why the tools can evolve according to the lesson that we do, but we want to stay as flexible as possible, because if we have so far elaborated more than 20 state building contracts, and there is no one which is the same of some others. So we really need to remain at the level of a tailor-made approach and flexibility, but to be clearer at the beginning in terms of objectives. So this is clear, more stabilization process or more long-term objective, and see how we can combine the different tools that we have with us to have a better response to the countries.
Okay. Thank you, Natalie. And just a collective thank you to our panel today. I hope you'll join me in thanking them for their contribution. And thank you for listening. You can take a cup of tea and a bicky on the way out if you like. Thank you. Thank you, Natalie.